how does one even summarize 8 months of pattern editing and code construction into a short-ish video? I don't consider myself a designer per se, but I definitely knew what bits and pieces I wanted on my garment after scouring Pinterest for weeks, looking at portraits, caricatures, and pictures of extant coats from the Regency era. This video isn't so much on how to construct the coat, since I'm still on this learning journey myself, and I left out a lot of building elements, but about the hopefully informed design choices I made, and the things I learned along the way. Hi! Thank you for joining me on the channel. I spent a lot of time on this coat, so hopefully you enjoy. Let's go on a sewing adventure. I wanted to make sure the pattern was quite firm around my waist, while not having a waist seam, since waist seams didn't really start showing up until the later 18 teens. I wanted the sleeves to start at the period-appropriate shoulder point, which was much further into the body than the modern sleeve. I also wanted a slight puff to the sleeves, as I had seen in fashion plates of the 18 teens, but not so much to look like it's the 1830s. I was about to be ready to make my first full mock-up in this cheap plaid canvas I found, but then learned the tails weren't sitting right, and I had to revise the front body pattern and change the angles of the tails to lay on me bum a lot more smoothly. I don't know what this was, but I was apparently planning for my tails to go through a lot of hot dance moves. I also wanted free rein to customize my collar, so I attached a wide collar to be marked and cut down as I saw fit. I tried many collars with different variations to the M-cut. I find Regency coat collars from commercial historical patterns a bit cartoonishly large, and try to recreate collars that I've seen in portraits. This one from a Louis Leopold Boyer painting. Entrance to a free show at the Ambigu Comique Theatre, circa 1819. I purchased 3 yards of blue superfine broadcloth wool from K&P Historical Textiles. One of the perks of this broadcloth is that it can be cut with a raw edge that won't fray. Now that I was super sure of my pattern, enough, I laid it down and started the marking and cutting process. If you notice, there are extra chalk lines along parts of the lapel, since I still have not yet made any final decisions quite yet. This is the face of someone excited and scared to cut into this gorgeous wool broadcloth for the first time. This little strip I'm cutting will act as a false pleat to go along the tails of the coat. Thread marking carefully and accurately took a long 2 days, I believe. Since I will be hand sewing most of the coat, I wasn't working with seam allowance, just marking the sewing line. I find the flip side of the thread markings so satisfying. The first stitches were made into the center back piece, since it's just an easy straight line up. Also very satisfying is pulling apart the thread marked pieces, spreading out the thread and cutting the pieces free. I believe here I'm sewing together a front piece to the backs here. These seams are large curves which need extra attention. Which is why I keep turning over to check if it's following the line on both sides. I can't imagine just trusting to do this with a sewing machine. I need that sense of control over these fussy seams that will turn the garment into a 3D piece. After all the crappy mock-up fabric I have been using, I finally get the satisfaction of pressing this wool broadcloth that irons down absolutely beautifully. You can see how excited I am here. Don't forget to use the clapper for the most refined seams. This is a wood block as a part of my knife sharpening kit for my oboe reed knives. Though a lesson I learned here is that I shouldn't have used the iron right to the fabric, or maybe should have put a piece of cloth down as it sort of ruined the pile. Not the biggest deal, but in bright lights it is visible on the back of the coat. It did kind of start to drive me crazy, but I'm okay now, if anyone was worried. I actually did test by ironing a piece first, but the issue wasn't obvious on a small test piece. Okay, the canvas interlining. Cut to the shape of the pattern plus some extra room. Starting with the fold line that I marked up with a Sharpie instead of thread marking since it's the quickest and won't be seen. Basically a pad stitch in one direction along the line while holding the fabric in the desired folded position, and stitching again in the other direction to reinforce the fold to create X-looking kind of stitches. Once the fold line and pad stitching of the rest of the collar was gone, just needed to trim away the excess along the pattern line to allow for some seam allowance to fold over. Finally, it was time for a first try-on. One of the biggest things that motivates me to get projects done quickly is the burning desire to know how it will fit and if it will fit as soon as possible. I want to know! I want to feel the fantasy, whether it's a mock-up or the final piece. My brain wants to get together the front and back pieces particularly as soon as absolutely possible. The sleeves, So an undecided dilemma I had was how I wanted the bottom of the coat cut. I initially thought it would be very of the period to have a curved front that eases into the tails, but at the last minute I decided to add some sharper lines that would be cut straight then angle off into the tails. I chose this because it seemed to have a cleaner look. After freeing myself of decision paralysis, I committed to it and hemmed it all down. Okay, back to the front of the coat since the collar is bare naked. Time to iron down the seam allowances so that I can then add the facing piece. This time I'm using a scrap piece of fabric after learning my lesson with ironing the center back seam. I made this facing and quilted the shoulders, backed with a scrap, felty, cushy, woolly material. You could pad the chest area as well, but my chest is naturally padded because I work out, bro. I referred to the book The Agreeable Tyrant for the interlining and padding of the inside of the coat. So I kind of feel like this collar is kind of my child. Along with my bespoke coat pattern and a collar to match, I painstakingly birthed this child of mine from so many drafts and mock-ups. I had to add a seam allowance to this collar pattern because my brain doesn't quite understand how to attach the collar to the edge of the lapel of the coat without the visual. See here, there's two options because I'm still not quite sure how the collar and lapel will lay back or drape once attached and worn. Preparing the canvas to be pad stitched to the bottom collar piece. Mostly involves drawing in with pencil how the pad stitching will go, marking the center fold and drawing rows of parallel curved lines. I think I put a ½ inch apart. Okay. Let's go to a zen place because the pad stitching could be a long, physical, and emotional haul since I've only practiced it once before. Also, because I recorded some of my long-haul hand sewing as ASMR videos. If you're into that, check them out. Little scissor snips and stitches. But here's me doing a line of pad stitching after the center line had been done. And after all that, it seems to sit well. I'm not a fan of super sharp folds of the collar to lie flat against the edge, since I personally interpret a lot of Regency period portraits as there being a shadow under the collars, indicative of a bit of space underneath the fold of the collar. What do you think after looking at these? Alternatively, there are flatter collars in some portraits, but I didn't personally want to go this route. I had to order this pure silk velvet from Etsy since apparently I could only find rayon silk blends in New York. It is very satisfying to stare at its luster. Kinda hard to capture on camera, but it feels so magical when it hits the light the right way. I very carefully added a fusible interlying. I just needed this to give it a tad more structure since it will be gently laid on top of the collar to mostly drape and be attached on some edges. Here I am making sure the velvet is just tight enough that it lays well but still firmly held down at the edges that are sewn down. Okay, gotta try it on, feel the lustrous velvet fantasy for seconds before the stress of sewing it to the coat and hoping it all turns out laying well. This is a time when all of the knowledge and care in pressing one's seams open really matter. Then a scary cut here as I cut the seam allowance of the M lapel to shape since the velvet will be rolled over it and fell down. After some really tense and fussy sewing down of the velvet to the M part of the lapel and beyond, I had a pretty successful lapel. I noticed the white chunks of the canvas poking through, which drove me crazy, but I just colored them in with a bit of black fabric marker. So, I guess this is what you would call my version of draping. Once I had the front tails and the false pleat and the back sitting the way I wanted, I started pinning approximately where things should be creased and ironed to lay best. This was kind of a satisfying puzzle to make things symmetrical and then iron them in place. Then when I got brave enough, I cut the tails even. Apparently, I have zero footage of me sewing in the sleeves. If there was, it would be hours of me trying and redoing the placement and figuring out how to properly gather the sleeves just to get a slight hint of puff. I think I even tried gathering the sleeves with a chopstick because I just didn't know quite how to do it just yet. So close! After finishing up the lining/facing, it was time to do some inside work to the tails, adding a small lining to them as well. Then onto the buttons. My buttonholes aren't awful, but I'm still glad that they are the same color of the fabric. This wool is very forgiving in this department. Since it doesn't fray or feel too fibrous, it's easier to keep buttonhole stitches more even. Or I could have kept the buttonholes going up the lapel. I opted to do as few as possible.